At the custody hearing for my grandson, my daughter-in-law shouted, "This old woman has mental issues, she can't even take care of herself." That's when my 8-year-old grandson looked at the judge and said, "Can I show you a video I recorded yesterday?" Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and comment the city you're watching from. I never thought I'd find myself sitting in a family court at 66 years old, fighting for the right to see my own grandson. But there I was, my hands trembling as I clutched my purse, watching my daughter-in-law Sarah pace back and forth like a caged animal preparing to strike. The courtroom felt cold and sterile, nothing like the warm living room where I used to read bedtime stories to Tommy. 8 years old now, he sat beside his mother, his little legs swinging from the chair, too short to reach the floor. He kept glancing at me with those big brown eyes that reminded me so much of my late son Michael. "Your Honor," Sarah's lawyer began, his voice echoing in the quiet room, "my client has serious concerns about Mrs. Virginia Patterson's mental state and her ability to provide a safe environment for the minor child." My heart started racing. Mental state? I gripped my purse tighter, feeling the eyes of everyone in the courtroom turning toward me. The bailiff, the court reporter, even the few other families waiting for their cases. They were all looking at me like I was some kind of specimen under a microscope. Sarah stood up then, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the harsh fluorescent lights. She was wearing a navy blue suit that probably cost more than my monthly pension, and she had that look on her face. The one she always got when she was about to say something cruel while pretending to be concerned. "Your Honor, I hate to say this about my late husband's mother, but Virginia has been exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior. She forgets to turn off appliances, she talks to herself, and last month I found her wandering around her neighborhood in her nightgown at 3 in the morning. The words hit me like physical blows. I wanted to stand up and scream that it wasn't true, that the night she was referring to was when I couldn't sleep and decided to get the newspaper from my front porch. I was fully dressed, not in my nightgown, but my throat felt closed up like someone was squeezing it shut. "She's becoming a danger to herself and others," Sarah continued, her voice getting louder, more theatrical. "Tommy comes home from visits with her telling me strange stories about conversations with his dead father. She's filling his head with nonsense and confusing him about reality." I felt tears burning behind my eyes. Those weren't strange stories. Those were precious moments where I'd share memories of Michael with his son, helping him understand what kind of man his father was. But now Sarah was twisting even that into something ugly. The judge, a stern-looking woman in her 50s, was taking notes. She looked up at me with what I could only describe as pity. That look broke something inside me. I wasn't some doddering old fool who needed to be managed. I was a retired nurse who had worked for 35 years, who had raised Michael as a single mother after his father abandoned us. Furthermore, Sarah's voice rose even higher, and I could see her cheeks flushing red with what looked like righteous indignation. "She doesn't even take proper care of herself anymore. Her house is a mess, she barely remembers to eat. And she's becoming increasingly paranoid, accusing me of keeping Tommy from her when I'm simply trying to protect my son." That's when she turned directly toward me, her eyes flashing with something that looked almost like triumph. "Your Honor, this woman has serious mental problems. She can barely take care of herself, let alone supervise an 8-year-old child. I cannot in good conscience allow my son to be alone with someone so unstable." The words echoed in the silent courtroom, and I felt like everyone was staring at me, waiting for me to defend myself or maybe even confirm what Sarah was saying. My mouth opened but no sound came out. How could I explain that everything she was saying was either a lie or a twisted version of the truth? My lawyer, a young man who I was paying with money I could barely afford, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, my client disputes these allegations. Mrs. Patterson is a retired registered nurse with no history of mental illness or—" "Objection to relevance," Sarah's lawyer interrupted smoothly. "Past employment doesn't negate current cognitive decline." The judge nodded. "Sustained. Please continue with your evidence, counselor." I watched in horror as Sarah's lawyer pulled out a thick folder. "We have photographs of Mrs. Patterson's home showing unsanitary conditions, witness statements from neighbors regarding erratic behavior, and medical records that show she's been skipping doctor's appointments and failing to take prescribed medications properly." Each piece of evidence felt like another nail in my coffin. The photographs were from the day after Michael's funeral, when I was so devastated I couldn't bring myself to clean. The medical appointments I'd supposedly skipped were actually rescheduled because Sarah had changed Tommy's visitation times at the last minute. But how could I prove that now? Tommy had been quiet through all of this, just swinging his legs and occasionally looking between his mother and me. I wondered what he was thinking, if he believed what his mother was saying about me. Did he think I was crazy too? That's when something unexpected happened. Tommy raised his small hand, and his voice cut through the tense atmosphere like a bell. "Excuse me," he said. His voice surprisingly clear and confident for an 8-year-old addressing a judge. "Can I show you something?" Sarah's face went completely white. She reached over and grabbed Tommy's arm, a little too hard. "Tommy, sweetheart, adults are talking right now. We'll discuss this later." But Tommy pulled his arm free and looked directly at the judge. "I made a video yesterday. Can I show it to you? It's really important." The entire courtroom seemed to freeze. Sarah's mouth fell open, and for the first time since we'd walked into that room, she looked genuinely frightened. Her lawyer started to say something, but the judge held up her hand for silence. "What kind of video, young man?" the judge asked, her tone gentler than it had been all morning. Tommy reached into his small backpack and pulled out what looked like a tablet. "I've been recording things at home. Mommy doesn't know. Grandma Virginia taught me how to use the camera app when she was helping me with my school project last month." Sarah lunged forward, her composed mask finally slipping completely. "Tommy, put that away right now. You don't know what you're doing." But it was too late. The judge was already gesturing for Tommy to approach the bench, and I could see that whatever was on that tablet, it had the power to change everything. To understand how I ended up in that courtroom, fighting for basic visitation rights with my own grandson, I need to go back to the beginning. Back to the day my world shattered and Sarah saw her opportunity. Michael died on a Tuesday. Heart attack at 34. Completely unexpected. One moment he was coaching Tommy's little league team, the next he was gone. I remember the phone call from Sarah. Her voice eerily calm as she delivered the news that would destroy everything I thought I knew about my life. "Virginia, you need to come to the hospital. Michael collapsed during practice." By the time I got there it was over. My only child, the boy I'd raised alone after his father walked out when he was 5, was gone. I held his still warm hand and felt like my heart was being ripped from my chest. But even in that moment of devastating grief, I noticed something strange. Sarah wasn't crying. She was making phone calls, handling arrangements, already moving forward while I was still trying to process that my son would never hug me again. The funeral was a blur of casseroles and condolences, but I remember one moment with crystal clarity. Sarah pulled me aside after the service, her hand on my arm in what looked like a comforting gesture to anyone watching. "Virginia, I think it would be best if Tommy and I had some space to grieve privately for a while. This has been so traumatic for him. And seeing you so upset just makes it harder." I was so consumed by my own pain that I didn't question it. I thought she was being protective of Tommy, helping him cope with losing his father. I agreed to give them a week, maybe 2, to adjust. 2 weeks turned into a month. When I called to ask about visiting, Sarah's voice had taken on a different tone. "Oh, Virginia, I'm so sorry, but Tommy's been having nightmares. The therapist thinks it's because visits with you remind him too much of Michael. Maybe we should wait a little longer." A therapist. She'd gotten Tommy into therapy without even telling me. When I asked which therapist, she gave me a name I'd never heard before. When I asked if I could speak to this person about Tommy's treatment, Sarah said that would be inappropriate, since I wasn't his legal guardian. That's when I started to understand what was happening, but I was still too deep in my own grief to fight it properly. Michael had been my anchor, my purpose, my greatest achievement. Without him, I felt lost and confused, and Sarah was using that confusion against me. The isolation was methodical, almost surgical in its precision. First, she changed Tommy's school pickup routine, claiming it was too confusing for him to have multiple people picking him up. Then she enrolled him in after-school programs that ran until 6 p.m., making afternoon visits impossible. When I suggested weekend visits, there was always something. A birthday party, a soccer game, a family commitment on her side. "I'm not trying to keep him from you," she would say with that false sweetness that made my skin crawl. "I just think consistency is important for him right now." But the worst part was how she started painting my grief as something pathological. When I mentioned that I still set a place at the table for Michael sometimes, she told Tommy's new therapist that I was having difficulty distinguishing reality from fantasy. When I bought Tommy a picture frame with his father's photo for his birthday, she called it morbid and said I was traumatizing the child with my inability to let go. 3 months after the funeral, I finally managed to have Tommy over for an afternoon. He seemed different, more distant, like he was studying me instead of just being with me. We were looking through photo albums of his father when he said something that chilled me to the bone. "Mommy says you might be getting sick in your brain like old people do sometimes. She says that's why you say weird things about Daddy." I stared at this beautiful 8-year-old boy, my grandson who looked so much like Michael at that age, and realized what Sarah was doing. She wasn't just keeping him from me. She was poisoning him against me, preparing him to believe that anything I said or did was the result of mental illness, rather than love or grief. "Tommy," I said carefully, "what kind of weird things does Mommy say I talk about?" He shrugged, playing with the edge of the photo album. "Like how Daddy used to make pancakes shaped like dinosaurs, or how he taught me to whistle. Mommy says you're making those up because your brain is confused. Those weren't made-up memories. Those were real moments I'd witnessed, precious pieces of my son's relationship with his child." But Sarah was systematically erasing them, replacing them with doubt about my mental state. That night, after I took Tommy home, I heard her talking to him in the hallway while I stood at the door. "See how Grandma got upset when we talked about Daddy? That's what the doctor meant about her having a hard time. We need to be extra gentle with her because her mind isn't working right anymore." The manipulation was breathtaking in its cruelty. She was using my natural grief, the normal human response to losing a child, as evidence of cognitive decline. Every tear I shed was proof of my instability. Every memory I shared was a delusion. Every expression of love for my dead son was twisted into a symptom. Over the next few months, the visits became even more rare. Sarah would call the day before a planned visit to cancel, always with an excuse that sounded reasonable on the surface but felt orchestrated underneath. "Tommy's feeling a bit under the weather. We had a last-minute invitation from my sister. The therapist thinks it's better if we stick to a routine right now." When I did see Tommy, usually for an hour or two in Sarah's presence, I could feel her watching me, cataloging every interaction, every word I said. If I told Tommy a story about his father, she would later claim I was living in the past. If I brought him a small gift, she would say I was trying to buy his affection. If I cried, which happened more often than I wanted, she would comfort Tommy afterward by explaining that Grandma was not feeling well. The truly insidious part was how she involved other people in her campaign. She would mention my episodes to neighbors, always with great concern and sadness, as if she was bearing the burden of caring for a mentally ill relative. She told Michael's friends that I was struggling with some cognitive issues, and that visits needed to be supervised because I sometimes got confused about what was appropriate to say to a child. By the time I realized the full extent of what was happening, I was completely isolated. The few friends I had were either dead or too far away to visit regularly. Michael's friends had been convinced I was mentally unstable. Even my neighbors looked at me with pity and concern, thanks to Sarah's careful campaign of whispered conversations and concerned phone calls. The final blow came 6 months after Michael's death, when I called to arrange a Christmas visit with Tommy. Sarah's voice was cold, clinical, like she was talking to a difficult patient rather than her late husband's mother. "Virginia, I think we need to discuss some boundaries. Tommy's therapist and I have serious concerns about your mental health. Until you can provide documentation that you're receiving appropriate psychiatric care, I don't think unsupervised visits are in his best interest." Psychiatric care? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Sarah, I'm grieving my son, not having a mental breakdown. Refusing to acknowledge that you need help is part of the problem," she replied smoothly. "I've documented several incidents of erratic behavior, and I have witnesses who can confirm that your judgment has been compromised. If you want to continue seeing Tommy, you'll need to work with a mental health professional." That's when I knew I had to fight back. That's when I called the lawyer and filed for grandparent visitation rights. But by then, Sarah had already built her case against me, brick by brick, using my own grief as the foundation for her lies. She had spent 8 months systematically destroying my reputation, my relationship with my grandson, and my own sense of reality. Now, sitting in that courtroom listening to her perform for the judge, I understood that this had never been about protecting Tommy from an unstable grandmother. This had been about erasing me entirely from their lives, and she had almost succeeded. The months leading up to that courtroom were the darkest of my life, and that's saying something for a woman who buried her only child. Sarah's campaign against me wasn't just about keeping Tommy away. It was about making me question my own sanity, my own worth, my very grip on reality. It started with small things that I almost didn't notice at first. When I would call Tommy, Sarah would put him on speakerphone and coach his responses in the background. I could hear her whispered prompts. "Tell Grandma you're tired," or "Remember what we talked about." Tommy's natural chatter, his excited stories about school and friends, gradually became stilted one-word answers. "How was school today, sweetheart?" "Fine." "Did you finish that project we talked about?" "I don't remember." "Tommy, it's about dinosaurs. You love dinosaurs just like your daddy did." Long pause, then Sarah's voice in the background. "Grandma, Tommy doesn't really like dinosaurs anymore. That was just a phase." But I knew better. Michael had been obsessed with dinosaurs as a child, and Tommy had inherited that fascination. Sarah was systematically erasing these connections between my grandson and his father, replacing them with her own version of who Tommy was supposed to be. The real psychological warfare began when Sarah started involving other people in her narrative. She would call my neighbors, expressing concern about my declining health. She was masterful at it, always sounding worried rather than malicious. Mrs. Henderson from next door knocked on my door one afternoon, her face creased with concern. "Virginia, dear," Sarah called me. "She's worried about you. She said you've been forgetting to bring in your mail and leaving your garden hose running." I stared at her, confused. I always brought in my mail, and I hadn't used the garden hose in weeks because of the drought restrictions. But Mrs. Henderson was looking at me with such pity that I started to doubt myself. Had I forgotten the mail? Was I losing track of simple tasks? "She also mentioned that you've been talking to Michael," Mrs. Henderson continued gently. "Honey, I know grief can do strange things to a person's mind." The conversation I'd had with Sarah the week before suddenly made sense. I'd mentioned to Tommy during one of our brief phone calls that I still talked to his daddy sometimes when I missed him, the way people talk to photographs or grave sites. It was a normal part of grief, something I'd seen countless families do during my nursing career. But Sarah had twisted it into evidence of delusions. "I don't talk to Michael like he's actually here," I tried to explain to Mrs. Henderson. Sometimes I tell his picture about my day, or I'll say something like, 'Your son is growing up so fast,' when I'm looking at photos." But I could see the doubt in her eyes. Sarah had already poisoned the well. The grocery store became another battlefield. Sarah had apparently spoken to several of the cashiers, expressing concern about my confusion with money and my tendency to wander around the store looking lost. Suddenly, every normal interaction became loaded with suspicion. When I took a few extra minutes to decide between two brands of cereal, I caught the cashier exchanging glances with a coworker. When I had to dig through my purse for exact change because I was trying to use up my loose coins, the woman behind me in line sighed impatiently and muttered something about holding up the line. I started avoiding places where I might run into people who knew Sarah. The isolation was suffocating, but it felt safer than facing their pitying looks and concerned questions about my health. The worst part was how Sarah documented everything. She had somehow gotten my doctor's office to confirm my appointments, and when I had to reschedule 2 visits because of conflicts with Tommy's school events, she presented it as evidence that I was non-compliant with medical care and showing signs of self-neglect. She photographed my house on the day I was too depressed to clean, when dishes sat in my sink and mail piled up on my counter. She didn't mention that this was the anniversary of Michael's death, or that I'd spent the entire day in bed crying. She just presented the images as proof of my inability to maintain basic hygiene and organization. Every normal human behavior was reframed as a symptom. When I bought Tommy a birthday present 3 weeks early because I saw something perfect for him, Sarah told people I was confused about dates and showing signs of temporal disorientation. When I called the school to ask about Tommy's grades because I wanted to help him with homework during our visits, she claimed I was inappropriately inserting myself into his education and showing signs of boundary confusion. The gaslighting was so systematic, so thorough, that I began to question everything about myself. When I forgot where I put my car keys, instead of recognizing it as normal middle-aged forgetfulness, I wondered if this was the beginning of the mental decline Sarah kept talking about. When I cried while watching a movie that reminded me of Michael, I wondered if my emotional responses were inappropriate or excessive. I started keeping detailed journals, trying to document my thoughts and activities to prove to myself that I was still rational, still competent. But even that became evidence against me when Sarah somehow got hold of one of my notebooks during a visit and used it to show how obsessed I was with tracking my own behavior. The isolation grew worse as Sarah expanded her circle of influence. She spoke to the pharmacist about my confusion with medications after I asked a routine question about side effects. She mentioned my memory issues to the librarian when I couldn't remember the title of a book I wanted to reserve. She expressed concern to my hairdresser about my mood swings after I had what she described as an emotional outburst, which was actually just me crying when the hairdresser asked how I was doing on the anniversary of Michael's death. Every interaction became suspect. Every emotion was pathologized. Every mistake or moment of sadness was cataloged as evidence of my deteriorating mental state. The cruelest part was how she used Tommy as both weapon and witness. During the few supervised visits I was allowed, she would prompt him to ask questions designed to make me look unstable. "Grandma, Mommy says you think Daddy still comes to visit you. Is that true? Tommy, did you take your medication today? Mommy says old people sometimes forget. Grandma, why do you always cry when you talk about Daddy? Mommy says healthy people don't cry so much." Each question was designed to put me in an impossible position. If I tried to explain the complexity of grief to an 8-year-old, Sarah would claim I was burdening him with inappropriate emotional content. If I deflected or changed the subject, she would say I was being evasive and hiding my symptoms. The final straw came when Sarah arranged for Tommy to stay overnight with me for the first time in months. I was so excited, so grateful for the chance to have real time with my grandson. I planned activities, bought his favorite snacks, set up the guest room with clean sheets and extra blankets. But throughout the visit, Tommy kept asking strange questions and making comments that didn't sound like him at all. "Grandma, do you remember what you had for breakfast? Are you sure you locked the front door? Mommy says I should tell her if you do anything weird." I realized that Sarah had coached him to observe and report on my behavior, turning my own grandson into a spy in his grandmother's house. An 8-year-old child was being used to gather evidence against me. That night, as I tucked Tommy into bed, he said something that broke my heart completely. "Grandma, are you going to forget me like you forgot other things?" "Oh, sweetheart," I whispered, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "I could never forget you. You're the most important thing in my life. But Mommy says your brain is getting sick, and sick brains forget people they love." I sat there in the dark, listening to my grandson's worried breathing, and realized that Sarah wasn't just trying to take him away from me. She was preparing him for the day when she would tell him I was too sick to see him anymore, when she would explain that forgetting him was just another symptom of my deteriorating condition. The next morning, after I returned Tommy to Sarah, I found out the real purpose of the overnight visit. She had arranged for Mrs. Henderson to check on me twice during the evening, ostensibly because she was worried about my ability to supervise a child overnight. Both times, Mrs. Henderson found me doing normal grandparent things, helping Tommy with homework, making him dinner. But Sarah later described these check-ins as welfare visits, necessitated by my declining capacity. By the time I finally got my court date, I was barely recognizing myself anymore. The confident, competent woman who had worked as a registered nurse for 35 years had been replaced by someone who second-guessed every decision, questioned every memory, and lived in constant fear of providing more ammunition for Sarah's campaign against her. I was tired. I was isolated. I was starting to believe that maybe there was something wrong with me, that maybe I really was becoming the burden Sarah described. But I wasn't crazy, and I wasn't giving up on Tommy, no matter how systematically Sarah had tried to destroy my credibility and my sense of self. That little boy was all I had left of Michael, and I would fight for him even if it meant exposing myself to more humiliation in that courtroom. What I didn't know was that Tommy had been fighting for me too, in his own 8-year-old way, documenting the truth that no adult seemed willing to see. The judge took Tommy's tablet with careful hands, as if she understood that whatever was on that device might change everything. Sarah was gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles had turned white, and her lawyer was frantically whispering something in her ear that she kept shaking her head at. "Tommy," the judge said gently, "can you tell me when you made this video?" "Yesterday," he answered, his voice clear and steady. "And some other ones too. I've been making them for a while because I wanted someone to know the truth about Grandma Virginia." My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. What had this precious child recorded? What truth was he talking about? Part of me was terrified that Sarah had somehow manipulated even this, that Tommy's truth would be another nail in my coffin. The judge connected the tablet to a larger screen so the entire courtroom could see. "This may be difficult to watch," she warned, looking at all the adults present. "If at any point the child's welfare seems to be at risk in these recordings, we'll stop immediately." The first image that appeared on the screen was Tommy's face, very close to the camera. He looked younger somehow, more vulnerable than he did sitting in the courtroom. The timestamp showed it was from 3 weeks ago. "Hi," he whispered to the camera. "I'm making this video because I think my mom is lying about Grandma Virginia, and nobody believes me when I try to tell them." Sarah made a sound like a wounded animal and started to stand up, but her lawyer pulled her back down. The judge held up a hand for silence. Tommy's recorded voice continued. "Grandma Virginia isn't crazy like Mom says. She doesn't forget things or do weird stuff. Mom tells her I said things that I never said, and she tells me Grandma said things that don't sound like her at all." The camera angle shifted, and suddenly we could see into what looked like Sarah's kitchen. Tommy had hidden the tablet somewhere high, maybe on top of the refrigerator, angled down toward the breakfast table. "Mom doesn't know I can hear her when she talks on the phone," the recorded Tommy continued in a whisper. "But I can. I hear everything." On the screen we watched Sarah pacing around her kitchen, phone pressed to her ear. The audio was clear enough to make out her words. "No, she definitely has early-stage dementia," Sarah was saying to whoever was on the other end. "Tommy comes home confused after every visit. Yesterday he asked me why Grandma keeps talking about his father like he's still alive." My breath caught in my throat. I had never talked about Michael like he was still alive, and Tommy had never seemed confused after our visits. But here was Sarah telling someone exactly the opposite. The recording continued with Sarah's voice. "I'm documenting everything for the court case. The judge needs to see that she's not competent to be around a child unsupervised." There was a pause, then Sarah laughed, a sound that made my skin crawl. "Oh, she has no idea. She actually thinks she's going to win custody. It's almost sad, really. The old woman is completely delusional about her own mental state." In the courtroom, Sarah had gone completely pale. Her mouth was opening and closing like she was trying to speak, but no sound was coming out. The video shifted to another day, another angle. This time, Tommy had apparently hidden the tablet in the living room, and we could see Sarah coaching him before one of our phone calls. "Remember, Tommy, when Grandma asks about school, just say fine and nothing else. If she tries to tell you stories about your father, I want you to say you don't want to hear them because they make you sad." "But they don't make me sad," 8-year-old Tommy protested. "I like hearing about Daddy." "That's not the point," Sarah snapped, her voice sharp with irritation. "The point is to show the judge that she's inappropriate with you, that she doesn't understand boundaries." "But Grandma never does anything inappropriate," Tommy said, confusion clear in his voice. Sarah's face darkened. "Tommy, we've talked about this. Grandma is sick, and sometimes sick people don't realize they're doing wrong things. You need to help me protect you from her. Do you understand?" On the screen, we watched my grandson's small shoulders slump in defeat. "Okay, Mommy." The courtroom was dead silent except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. This was worse than I had imagined. Sarah hadn't just been lying about me. She had been actively coaching Tommy to lie too, manipulating an 8-year-old child into participating in her campaign against his own grandmother. But the videos weren't finished. The scene shifted again, and this time we were seeing one of my actual visits with Tommy. Sarah had insisted on supervising this one, claiming it was necessary for Tommy's safety, but what we saw on the screen told a very different story. Tommy had apparently set up the tablet to record our entire interaction. On screen we watched as I helped him with his math homework, patiently explaining multiplication tables and praising him when he got the right answers. We watched as I made him a snack and listened to him tell me about his soccer practice. Most importantly, we watched Sarah interrupting constantly, inserting herself into every conversation, and deliberately misinterpreting everything I said. When Tommy told me he missed his father, I gently said, "I miss him too, sweetheart. But you know what? Every time I look at you, I see the best parts of your daddy, and that makes me happy." On the recording, Sarah immediately jumped in. "Tommy, remember what we talked about. You don't need to discuss your father if it makes you uncomfortable." "It doesn't make me uncomfortable," Tommy said, looking confused. "I want to talk about Daddy." "Sweetheart, sometimes we think we want to do things that aren't actually good for us," Sarah replied, her voice dripping with false concern. "Grandma doesn't understand that talking about death can be harmful for children." I watched my recorded self take a deep breath and try again. "Tommy, would you like to see the photo album I made of you and your father?" Before Tommy could answer, Sarah cut in again. "Actually, Virginia, Tommy's therapist has advised against focusing too much on the past. We're trying to help him move forward." The lies were breathtaking in their audacity. On the recording, I looked frustrated and hurt, exactly the way Sarah would later describe as evidence of my inappropriate emotional responses. But the most damaging video was the last one. The timestamp showed it was from just 2 days ago, and this time Tommy had recorded Sarah when she thought he was asleep. We watched Sarah on the phone again, but this time she was talking to someone who was apparently helping her prepare for the custody hearing. "The key is to make her look unstable without being too obvious about it," Sarah was saying. "I've got the neighbors convinced, and her doctor's office has confirmed that she's been missing appointments. The judge will see a pattern of declining mental health." "What if she tries to defend herself?" the person on the other end asked. We couldn't hear their side clearly, but Sarah's responses told us everything we needed to know. "She won't be able to," Sarah laughed. "I've been documenting every little thing for months. Every time she cries, every time she forgets something minor, every time she does anything that could be interpreted as odd behavior. The woman is so isolated now that she doesn't have anyone to contradict my version of events." There was a pause, then Sarah continued. "The beauty of it is that she actually thinks she's fighting for Tommy's best interests. She has no idea that he's already been taught to see her as unstable. By the time this goes to court, her own grandson will be a witness against her." In the courtroom, I felt like I might be sick. All those months of questioning my own sanity, of wondering if I really was becoming the burden Sarah described, it had all been orchestrated. Every doubt I'd had about myself had been deliberately planted. But Tommy wasn't finished. His small voice came through the tablet speakers one more time. "I made these videos because I love my grandma Virginia," he said, his face close to the camera again. "She never did any of the things Mom says she did. She always remembers my favorite snacks and my friends' names and everything about my daddy. She helps me with my homework and reads me stories and never makes me feel bad for missing my father." His voice got stronger, more determined. "Mom is the one who's lying. She's the one who makes me say things that aren't true. And she doesn't know that I hear her on the phone talking about how she's going to make sure I never see Grandma Virginia again." The video ended with Tommy looking directly into the camera with those serious brown eyes that reminded me so much of Michael. "I don't want to live with someone who lies all the time. I want to live with Grandma Virginia because she's the only one who tells me the truth about my daddy, and about everything else too." The courtroom erupted. Sarah's lawyer was frantically trying to object to something, claiming the recordings were inadmissible or taken without consent. Sarah herself was crying, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of fury at being caught. "Your Honor," she called out, her voice high and desperate. "You can't trust anything that child says. He's been poisoned against me by that woman. This is exactly what I was trying to protect him from. But it was too late." The judge was looking at Sarah with an expression I'd seen many times during my nursing career. The look healthcare workers give to family members who've been caught abusing vulnerable patients. "Mrs. Patterson," the judge said, turning to me with a completely different tone than she'd used before, "I believe we need to have a very different conversation about custody arrangements." As I sat there watching Sarah's carefully constructed house of lies collapse around her, I felt something I hadn't experienced in almost a year. Hope. My grandson had been braver than any adult in this situation, risking his own safety to document the truth that everyone else had been too manipulated to see. Tommy looked at me across the courtroom and smiled. It was the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in months, and in that moment, I knew that no matter what happened next, I hadn't lost him after all. The silence in the courtroom after Tommy's videos ended was deafening. Everyone seemed frozen in place, processing what we had just witnessed. Then, like a dam bursting, everything happened at once. Sarah shot up from her chair, her face twisted with rage. "This is ridiculous. You can't base a custody decision on recordings made by a child who doesn't understand what he's doing." "Sit down, Mrs. Patterson," the judge said firmly, her voice cutting through Sarah's protests like a blade. But Sarah was beyond reason now. The careful mask she'd worn for months was completely gone, and what remained was the true person my grandson had been living with. "That woman has manipulated my son against me. She's turned him into a liar just like she is. Mrs. Patterson, if you don't control yourself, I will have you removed from this courtroom," the judge warned, but Sarah was spiraling. "Tommy, tell them." She whirled around to face my grandson, pointing at him with shaking fingers. "Tell them how Grandma Virginia fills your head with nonsense about your father. Tell them how she makes you feel guilty for living with me instead of her." Tommy shrank back in his chair, his eyes wide with fear. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw him react to his mother the way a child should never have to react to a parent, with genuine terror. That's when something inside me finally snapped. I'd spent almost a year being quiet, being polite, trying to work within Sarah's twisted system. I'd let her paint me as unstable while I bent over backward to prove my competence. But watching her scream at my grandson, watching Tommy cower in fear, I realized that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop being reasonable with unreasonable people. I stood up slowly, my voice calm but carrying in the hushed courtroom. "Sarah, that's enough." She spun toward me, her eyes wild. "Don't you dare tell me what's enough. This is my son." "No," I said, taking a step forward. "Tommy is Michael's son. He's my grandson. And you've spent the last year trying to erase both of those facts." Sarah's lawyer was tugging at her sleeve, trying to get her to sit down, but she shook him off. "You have no rights here, old woman. You're nothing to us." The words hung in the air, and I saw several people in the courtroom exchange glances. Even Sarah seemed to realize she'd gone too far, but it was too late to take it back. "Your Honor," my lawyer said, finding his voice at last, "I think we're seeing exactly what my client and her grandson have been dealing with for the past year." The judge was taking notes furiously. "Indeed we are, Counselor. Mrs. Patterson," she addressed Sarah, who was now standing with her arms crossed, breathing heavily like she'd just finished running. "Your behavior in this courtroom, combined with the evidence we've just reviewed, paints a very concerning picture." "What evidence?" Sarah demanded. "Secret recordings made by a child who's been coached by his grandmother? That's not evidence, that's manipulation." "Mrs. Patterson," the judge's voice was dangerously quiet now, "are you claiming that the conversations we just heard on those recordings didn't take place?" Sarah's mouth opened and closed several times. She couldn't deny the recordings without admitting they were authentic, but she couldn't admit they were authentic without acknowledging what they revealed about her behavior. Those conversations were taken out of context," she finally stammered. "What context?" the judge asked. "Would make it appropriate to coach a child to lie about his relationship with his grandmother?" Sarah looked around the courtroom desperately, as if searching for support that wasn't there. Her lawyer had given up trying to control her, and was now sitting with his head in his hands. Even the court reporter was staring at Sarah with undisguised disgust. "I was protecting him," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction now. "Virginia is unstable. Everything I did was to protect Tommy from her influence." "Mrs. Patterson," the judge said, consulting her notes, "you've accused Mrs. Virginia Patterson of memory problems, inappropriate behavior, and mental instability. Yet the recordings we just viewed show a woman helping her grandson with homework, listening to his concerns, and speaking about his deceased father in age-appropriate ways. What exactly was she doing that required protection?" Sarah's face crumpled as she realized she was trapped. Every lie she'd told, every manipulation she'd orchestrated, had been captured on those recordings. There was no way to spin the truth we'd all just witnessed. She talks about Michael too much, Sarah said weakly. It's not healthy for Tommy to focus on the past. According to whom? The judge asked. You mentioned a therapist several times in your testimony. I'd like to speak with this professional. Sarah went pale. That's not necessary. The therapist agreed that. Mrs. Patterson, the judge interrupted. What is the name and contact information for Tommy's therapist? The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. Sarah's mouth moved soundlessly, and I began to understand that there might not be a therapist at all. It had been another lie, another piece of her elaborate fiction designed to support her case against me. Your Honor, Sarah's lawyer finally spoke up, his voice resigned. I need to request a brief recess to consult with my client. Denied, the judge said curtly. Mrs. Patterson, I asked you a direct question. What is the name of Tommy's therapist? We were between therapists, Sarah mumbled, looking at the floor. So when you testified that Tommy's therapist recommended limiting contact with his grandmother, you were lying under oath? The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, catching herself against the table. I wasn't lying. I was interpreting what a therapist would probably say. You were committing perjury, the judge corrected coldly. That's when Sarah completely lost control. She started crying. Not the manipulative tears I'd seen her use so effectively over the past year, but the ugly, desperate sobs of someone who knows their world is collapsing. You don't understand, she wailed. I lost my husband. I lost Michael. Tommy is all I have left, and she was trying to take him away from me. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. I understood the desperation of losing someone you love, the fear of being left alone. But then I remembered Tommy cowering in his chair, remembered the months of isolation and gaslighting, remembered the systematic campaign she'd waged against not just me, but against my grandson's right to know his own family history. Sarah, I said quietly, I was never trying to take Tommy away from you. I just wanted to be his grandmother. She looked up at me through her tears, and for just a second, I saw something that might have been regret. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the same bitter resentment that had fueled her campaign against me. It's too late now, she said, her voice hollow. You've turned him against me. He'll never forgive me for this. I glanced over at Tommy, who was sitting very still in his chair, watching his mother's breakdown with the serious expression of a child who's been forced to grow up too fast. Tommy, the judge said gently, would you like to come up here and talk to me privately for a few minutes? Tommy nodded and walked to the judge's bench. She leaned down to speak with him quietly, and I watched my grandson's face as he answered her questions. He looked relieved, like he'd been carrying a heavy weight that was finally being lifted from his shoulders. After a few minutes, the judge straightened up and looked around the courtroom. Based on the evidence presented today, including the recorded conversations and the testimony we've heard, I'm granting Mrs. Virginia Patterson immediate supervised visitation rights, with a recommendation for full custody evaluation within 30 days. Sarah let out a sound like a wounded animal. You can't do this. He's my son. Mrs. Patterson, the judge said sternly, your son has presented compelling evidence that you've been coaching him to lie, manipulating his relationship with his grandmother, and creating a hostile environment that prioritizes your control over his emotional well-being. A child should never have to secretly record his parent to protect his grandmother from false accusations. The judge turned to me, and her expression softened slightly. Mrs. Patterson, I want to apologize on behalf of this court for the ordeal you've endured. A grandparent's love for their grandchild should never be weaponized or used as evidence of mental instability. As the judge continued outlining the new custody arrangements, I felt a hand slip into mine. Tommy had quietly made his way over to where I was sitting, and he was looking up at me with those serious brown eyes. Grandma Virginia, he whispered, can I come home with you today? I squeezed his small hand, tears streaming down my face. Yes, sweetheart. You can come home with me today. Sarah was still crying, but her sobs had turned bitter and angry. As we prepared to leave the courtroom, she grabbed Tommy's arm one more time. You'll regret this, she hissed. When you're older, you'll understand that I was trying to protect you. Tommy looked at his mother with a sadness that broke my heart. "Mommy," he said quietly, "protecting someone shouldn't hurt them. Grandma Virginia taught me that." As we walked out of that courtroom together, my grandson's hand in mine, I realized that Sarah had been wrong about one thing. This wasn't about taking Tommy away from her. This was about giving him back the family she tried to steal from him, the connection she tried to sever, and the truth she tried to bury. The little boy walking beside me wasn't just my grandson anymore. He was also my hero, the bravest person I'd ever known, who had risked everything to make sure the truth finally came to light. 6 months later, I'm sitting in my kitchen watching Tommy carefully measure flour for the pancakes we're making together. It's Saturday morning, which has become our special baking day, and sunlight is streaming through the window. I never bothered to put curtains on because I love how bright it makes the room feel. "Grandma Virginia, did Daddy really like dinosaur pancakes when he was little?" Tommy asks, concentrating hard on not spilling the flour. "He loved them," I tell him, helping him steady the measuring cup. "He used to insist on naming each one before he could eat it. We had Brontosaurus Bob and Tyrannosaurus Ted and Stegosaurus Steve." Tommy giggles, the sound filling up all the empty spaces in my heart that I'd forgotten existed. "Can we make some today?" "We can make whatever shapes you want, sweetheart. This is our life now." Simple moments that Sarah had tried to convince a courtroom were evidence of my mental instability. Sharing stories about Michael helping with homework, making pancakes shaped like dinosaurs. The ordinary, precious routine of a grandmother and grandson who love each other. The custody evaluation that followed the hearing was thorough and frankly humiliating in its own way. Social workers visited my home, interviewed my neighbors, and spoke with Tommy's teachers. They required me to undergo psychological testing to prove I wasn't suffering from the dementia Sarah had spent months claiming I had. But for the first time in over a year, I wasn't alone in defending myself. Tommy's recorded videos had opened a floodgate of people coming forward to tell the truth about what they'd witnessed. Mrs. Henderson from next door admitted that Sarah had called her with concerns that seemed a bit excessive, and had asked her to report back on anything unusual she noticed about my behavior. The pharmacist confirmed that I'd never shown any signs of confusion about medications, just normal questions about side effects. Even Tommy's teacher revealed that Sarah had been asking inappropriate questions about whether Tommy seemed disturbed after spending time with me. The picture that emerged wasn't of a grandmother with declining mental health, but of a daughter-in-law who had orchestrated a systematic campaign of lies and manipulation. The social worker assigned to our case was particularly disturbed by the recordings of Sarah coaching Tommy to lie and create false narratives about our interactions. In 30 years of family services, she told me during one of our interviews, "I've rarely seen such deliberate psychological manipulation of a child." Tommy shows classic signs of being forced to participate in parental alienation against his will. The hardest part wasn't proving my competence. It was watching Tommy process what his mother had done to both of us. Children are remarkably resilient, but they're also remarkably perceptive. Tommy knew that his mother had lied, but understanding why was more complex. "Did Mommy really think you were sick?" he asked me one evening as I was tucking him into bed in what was now permanently his room. "I think your mommy was hurting very badly when your daddy died," I explained carefully. "Sometimes when people are hurting, they make choices that hurt other people too. That doesn't make it right, but it might help explain why she did what she did." Tommy was quiet for a long time processing this. "I still love her," he said finally. "Of course you do, sweetheart. She's your mother. It's okay to love someone and still know that what they did was wrong." Sarah fought the custody change initially, appealing the judge's decision and demanding supervised visitation rights of her own. But her behavior during the appeal process only reinforced everyone's concerns about her judgment. She violated the court's orders by showing up at Tommy's school unannounced, trying to convince his teachers that I was brainwashing him against her. She called social services repeatedly with increasingly wild accusations about my care of Tommy. The final straw came when she hired a private investigator to follow us, apparently hoping to document some evidence of the neglect and instability she'd been claiming all along. Instead, the investigator's photos showed Tommy and me at the library, at the grocery store, at his soccer practice, living a perfectly normal life together. When the investigator's report was submitted to the court, It actually supported my fitness as Tommy's guardian rather than undermining it. Sarah's lawyer withdrew from the case, and she eventually stopped fighting the custody arrangement. The last I heard, she'd moved to another state to live with her sister. Tommy receives birthday cards from her, but she hasn't asked to see him. I think in some twisted way, she's convinced herself that staying away is the noble thing to do. The final gesture of a mother protecting her child from a harmful influence. Tommy doesn't talk about her much, but when he does, it's with the complicated emotions of a child who's been betrayed by someone he should have been able to trust completely. We're working with a real therapist now. Not the imaginary one Sarah had invented for the court. And slowly helping him understand that none of what happened was his fault. You know what's funny? Tommy said to me last week as we were working on a jigsaw puzzle together. Mommy kept saying you were the one who was confused, but she was the one who couldn't remember what was true and what wasn't. Out of the mouths of babes. My 8-year-old grandson had figured out something that had taken me months to understand. Sarah hadn't just been lying to everyone else. She'd been lying to herself, creating a reality where her manipulation and control were acts of protection rather than selfishness. The house feels alive now in a way it hasn't since Michael died. Tommy's artwork is taped to the refrigerator, his soccer cleats are by the back door, and his collection of library books is stacked on the coffee table. The guest room that I'd sadly converted back to storage after Sarah's campaign began is now definitively Tommy's room, painted blue at his request and decorated with posters of dinosaurs and soccer players. We have dinner together every night at the kitchen table, and Tommy tells me about his day while I tell him about mine. We do homework together, and I help him practice his multiplication tables the same way I used to help his father. On Sundays we visit Michael's grave together, and Tommy leaves drawings he's made for his daddy. Do you think Daddy knows I'm living with you now? He asked me during one of these visits. I think your daddy knows that you're loved and safe, I told him. And I think that would make him very happy. The irony isn't lost on me that Sarah's attempt to erase me from Tommy's life actually gave me something I never would have had otherwise. Full custody of my grandson. If she'd simply allowed me normal grandparent visitation rights, Tommy would still be living with her, and I would see him on weekends and holidays. Instead, her greed for complete control ended up giving me exactly what she was trying to prevent. But more than that, her campaign against me gave Tommy and me a bond that might not have existed otherwise. We went through something together, survived something together. He fought for me when no adult would, and I fought for him when he couldn't fight for himself. That kind of shared experience creates a connection that can't be manufactured or destroyed. Sometimes I catch him looking at me with those serious brown eyes, and I can almost see him processing the contrast between the grandmother he actually has and the one his mother tried to convince everyone existed. He's learning, in his own 8-year-old way, about the difference between truth and manipulation, between love and control, between protection and possession. Grandma Virginia, he said to me yesterday as we were making our Saturday dinosaur pancakes. I'm glad I made those videos. Why's that, sweetheart? Because now everyone knows you're not crazy. You're just sad sometimes about Daddy, and that's okay because I get sad about him too. I had to turn away to wipe my eyes, overwhelmed by this child's wisdom and resilience. He understood something that all the adults in his life had failed to grasp. That grief is not pathology. That missing someone you love is not mental illness. That sadness is a normal human response to loss. As I write this, Tommy is at soccer practice, and I'm preparing his favorite dinner for when he gets home. Later, we'll work on his science project about the solar system, and I'll tuck him into bed with a story about when his father was his age. It's a quiet life, a normal life, the kind of life Sarah tried to convince a courtroom I was incapable of providing. But here's what I've learned in these months of healing and rebuilding. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is simply refuse to accept someone else's version of who you are. Sarah spent a year trying to convince me, Tommy, and everyone around us that I was mentally unstable, incompetent, and potentially dangerous. The scariest part wasn't that she was lying. It was that I almost started to believe her. Recovery wasn't just about proving my competence to a court or a social worker. It was about remembering who I actually was underneath all the doubt and fear Sarah had planted in my mind. I am a woman who worked as a registered nurse for 35 years, who raised a son as a single mother, who has survived loss and betrayal and come out stronger on the other side. I am not the confused, unstable woman Sarah described. I never was. And my grandson, brave and wise beyond his years, made sure the world knew the truth. The teddy bear I brought to the hospital the day Tommy was born sits on his dresser now. A little worn from months of being loved by a child who needed something soft to hold on to during the hardest period of his young life. Sometimes I look at that bear and remember the woman I was that day, hopeful, excited to meet her grandson, carrying a small gift and a heart full of love. That woman was never the problem. The problem was someone else's need to control, to possess, to rewrite reality to serve their own purposes. But truth has a way of surfacing, even when it's buried under months of lies and manipulation, especially when it's defended by an 8-year-old boy who loves his grandmother enough to risk everything to save her. Tommy and I are home now together, exactly where we belong.